Hey, this is Rob Anspach, and welcome back to another edition of E-Heroes. For those keeping count, this is episode 363, and we are going over to across the pond is what they say, to the UK, and I'm got my special friend Adam Cox on the podcast today. We're going to talk about hypnosis. We're going to talk about all kinds of things, but I think it's going to be a great show. And so, welcome, Adam, and I'm glad you're here.
It's great to be here, Rob. Thanks for the invite.
I just glanced over at your podcast, which is the Hypnotist podcast, and the one that popped out was the Mary Poppins magic bag of preparation, and it
Mhm.
was like, you know, I probably saw Mary Poppins 1,000 times, and yeah, sometimes she over prepares, but here you're helping a client refocus to I guess get more stuff done, to change
Yeah,
how they think.
it was an interesting one because I quite like finding metaphors from everywhere, and I speak at conferences sometimes about how movies are good sources of metaphors because you've got the characters which become role models, but you've also got some of the devices within the movie that you can kind of utilize. And even the plot line, there's the hero's journey in a lot of stories, not so much in Mary Poppins, but in other ones. And I hadn't seen Mary Poppins in ages, but a lot of my podcast actually comes from real client sessions. So when I created the podcast, I wanted to have an outlet for hypnosis that was authentic. So the essence of the podcast is that I do hypnotherapy sessions with my client. I only record my voice to protect the confidentiality of the client. And then there's like a 3 or 4 minute explanation of what I did with that particular client. And this client wanted to feel more prepared. So before the session, I said, look, is there a fictional character that you feel is really prepared? And she said Mary Poppins. And then I recall like the scene I remember. There's two scenes that I remember from Mary Poppins quite vividly. One is that she's got this bag, and it's like an unlimited bag. She can keep taking stuff out of it. And the other thing is that when they go to Hyde Park, they actually kind of, I think, jump into one of the street artist pictures, and they can go inside. And I use both of these devices as a way. Like one is a level of stage disassociation, and the other is a resource. So for this particular client, obviously, if you've got a magic bag that has whatever you need when you need it, that becomes a parallel to preparation. Because if you've done the preparation before you need the actual result of the preparation, that's like this magic bag. So that's why it was used. But for me, I also like making the sessions more interesting for me. So if I just did, let's say, standard hypnotherapeutic protocols like regression to cause or reframing or accessing a resource state, I must have published about nearly 2,000 episodes. I'm going to be bored if every episode is the same. The moment you create a different metaphor, a different context, it brings the whole thing alive. It increases engagement for the client, but also makes things way more interesting for people that listen to my podcast to have some kind of a new experience because your representation of Mary Poppins will be different from mine and different from the client's. Even though we've all seen the same movie,
Right.
you might identify with a different character than she did, for example. And because of that, we can have the same metaphor, but you might be preparing for your podcast or your business, and she's thinking about preparing meals to help her lose weight. So the same session can give entirely different experiences and outcomes.
Well, and then you also have, the cultural element. Yes, it's based in the UK. I'm in the United States. I may not get certain references,
Hmm.
so, you know, that may need to be explained further. But, we have and new generations of people have never even seen Mary Poppins. They might have heard Mary Poppins, especially in the one Guardians of the Galaxy movie where the character says, "I'm Mary Poppins, yo."
Hmm.
And, that's funny, but a lot of kids just don't get the reference.
It's
And
true.
so
Yeah.
when you're dealing with clients like that need a boost, maybe need, your extra time, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so almost every session, sometimes I was in Brazil recently and I was just getting inspiration from the cities and nature and those kind of things. And I'll create hypnosis sessions around that. But I would say 99.9% of the hypnosis sessions that I publish are for the client that I was working with, and then you're hearing what happened with them. So obviously, if I'm saying, "Do you think Mary Poppins is a good role model for preparation?" And they're like, "Who's Mary Poppins?" I'm not going to use that in the hypnosis session. So my obsession is doing things that kind of resonate and connect with the client that I'm working with, and then I publish it. And some people will get the references, and some people won't.
Mhm.
Some people will get the topics. If I'm working with someone for quitting smoking or losing weight, and someone's scrolling through my podcasts and they don't want to quit smoking or lose weight, they're just going to keep on scrolling by. But then they might see, unleash new levels of confidence, and they're like, "Ooh, I could do with a bit more of that." Or it might be something that relates to finances, or it might be productivity, and they're like, "Oh, I'll hone in on that one." So I'm not expecting every episode to be relevant to every person that listens. My obsession is with the client that I'm working with, but the byproduct of that is that there's enough many people in the world. Some people will connect with either the theme or the metaphor or the suggestions, and therefore still get some value from that.
Mhm. Yeah, I just glanced down and one of your podcast episodes is hypnosis to manifest a successful future as a writer.
Mm,
And I laughed
specific,
because,
yeah.
I've published 60 some books over the last, since 2012. And, when I was struggling on this concept of writing this one book, I thought, I'm just going to put all my blog posts into this. And I had this box full, and I thought, I'm going through it. And like, this is awful. Who's going to read this crap? And I just happened to be flying back from Arizona, and on the plane, out of all places, I get this idea and I start jotting it down. And by the time I was back in Pennsylvania, I had already written most of the book, which
Mm,
became Share. That was a title, but it was the easiest social media book you'll ever read. And from that point, every single book that have created or published or helped someone else publish, I've always kept it under 150 pages.
mm,
And people ask me why. I said, simplicity.
mm,
I want people when they get a book. In fact, I have a client's book right here. I'm like, it's thin. You know, in 2 hours you'll have it read and you can go about your day. And that's been the premise of every single book that I've published. Keep it simple.
mm.
And maybe somewhere along the line I was inspired. Maybe I was secretly hypnotized. I don't know. But it's I've and the thing is, I only wanted to set out to do one book. And then everybody's like, "Well, Rob, this was brilliant. Help me with this, help me with that." And, 60 books in 13 years.
Mm. And that's a high level of productivity to do that, because you've got the concept, the structure, the writing, the editing, and then the promotion and the marketing and that kind of stuff. And I think that everyone has something. Like for me, it's hypnosis. For you, it's writing. Everyone has something that um, gives them the possibility where it's not a chore to do it because it gives them so much back by doing it. And I think that unfortunately there's a lot of people in the world that haven't found that thing. So
Right.
they get caught in this narrative, this cultural narrative that they have to do a job that they hate to earn money to pay bills for things they don't want, and they're just caught in that kind of hamster wheel. But you found that writing gave you that ability to do something creative, to monetize it, and have an impact on every person that reads it. That's
Mhm.
how I feel about my podcast. Like every time I work with a client, the byproduct of that is it gives me more content to then share and publish, which then builds my audience, builds my credibility, and
Mm.
then leads to even more clients. And it feels like this kind of infinite flywheel where the downside is that I make more money and have more fun. and feel more fulfilled. Like, that's a nice byproduct if you find that thing. But
Mhm.
there's a lot of people that haven't found that thing, and I
Right.
think that's where, in certain cases there might be a block or some kind of resistance. That client that I was working with was a talented writer going through a horrible breakup. And because of that, the resources that they had when their head's in a good place was almost switched off. They couldn't get to that state. So for that particular client, I had them imagine going maybe 3, 4, 5 years in the future and seeing all of the evidence of success from their career as a fiction writer. I can see it's nonfiction for you from the books behind you. For her, it was fiction, and it was a case of that element of okay, well now I know it's possible, and then almost reverse engineering it. Like, what did she need to do to become a successful writer in that area? Well, you've got to write, you've got to be inspired, you've got to network and do certain things. And also, a lot of very very successful fiction writers, they need to build a franchise. They need to have the kind of things that can be merchandised and can turn into Broadway shows and kind of movie screenplays. And because she wanted the financial element as well as the kind of creative outlet, you can kind of fuse all of those in. And I would say, 99% of people scrolling through my podcasts would like hypnosis to be a successful writer. They'd be like, doesn't apply to me. You're like, but it doesn't have to apply for everyone, because writing could just be a metaphor for that thing that that individual is passionate about, but they're not necessarily doing that thing at this point in time. In which case, it might be writing for her, it might be for someone else, it might be being a personal trainer or being a social media influencer, or it might be something else. But I think there's a lot of people that have these kind of passions and dreams, and they're terrified to actually to do them just in case they fail.
Well, I think most people, when they think of hypnosis, think of, weight loss or stop smoking.
Mm.
But, there's other elements that, maybe you just wanna be a better husband. Maybe you just want to, not get so angry.
Hmm.
Maybe you want to, at least stay at a job more than 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And I think people forget about that. They think, "Oh my god, I have to hire a hypnotist so that I can be more successful, have more money." And when I sat down and wrote my book Legacy, one of the things that I remind people of is that your legacy doesn't have to be about fame and fortune. It could
Hmm.
be about what you leave behind, and it doesn't have to be about money. It could be knowledge, it could be your experiences, your adventures, and that's what the next generation learns from. And so, going back to you is that yes, I think Hollywood and some of these other mediums have made hypnosis one of those commodities that they think, oh, well, it's just for this particular thing like smoking or weight loss, but it could be for so much more.
It definitely can be, and it's not a bad thing, because sometimes the initial things become how people reconnect with something. They might be frustrated that they're not losing weight, and oh, I think hypnosis helps with that. And if that means that they stumble across my podcast, listen to a weight loss hypnosis session, and then they're like, oh, hypnosis for more passion in my personal relationship, and they're like, maybe I could benefit from that as well. And these things, these common things, can be an on ramp. I also think Hollywood is responsible for a lot of misconceptions around hypnosis as well. And I think the biggest misconception is that an individual is under the control of the hypnotist.
Hmm.
There's some great Hollywood movies like Trance, for example, with Angelina Jolie, and this whole idea that you can hypnotize someone to rob a bank for you, or you could hypnotize someone to kind of do this thing. And even if you remember some of the old Scooby Doo episodes, quite often the villain was a hypnotist, and they would, put them under the spell of their, swinging watch or pendulum. And I think there are a lot of people that are afraid to explore hypnosis or hypnotherapy because they don't want to lose control. And who would want to lose control? And the metaphor that I use to help give people an idea of what it's actually more like is, I say, look, if you were lost in a forest and you didn't know that forest at all, but someone else knew the forest very well and they offered to lead you out of the forest to somewhere safe, does that mean you're under the control of that person, or does it just mean that it's in your interest to work with someone that knows that terrain better than you do? And that's more what hypnosis is really like. When I've worked with close to, like, I don't know, like over 2,000 clients, you learn so much in all of those. The forest of the unconscious mind, I'm fairly comfortable and familiar with that terrain. So
Mm.
therefore, quite often I feel like people they feel stuck, they're lost in a maze, and they don't know how to get out of that particular situation. And eating or drinking or smoking or taking drugs or something feels like a solution to feeling stuck or stressed or anxious or whatever it might be. And then that keeps them stuck in the place where they are. And I think, we talked about kind of superpowers and those kind of things. I think one of the gifts that I've got, the ability that has come with experience, is I get to see their life in the maze from above. And maybe I've helped other people get out of their maze. And all that's different is, I'm not more intelligent than they are, but I have a different perspective and I have different experience, which means that something that might be very challenging for them is almost easy for me, just because I have that different perspective and that different experience to lead them out of that maze.
Mhm. Yeah. And that, I sometimes I stumble on my words because, it's just I'm trying to take it in. And I'm sure the listeners are too, but you know, we live in this fast-paced world where, our keyboards are right here. We can access everything. We have AI, we have Google, we have, all this information. And yet people will search for their symptoms, search to improve themselves. But when it comes down to it, really, sometimes they just need one person
Hmm.
to contact you and ask for help, and or contact anybody really. It's just, you are probably one of the, elite uh, people in your field, only because of experience and years of doing this. Then you said you had, thousands of clients, and those clients teach you something. Not every one is going to have the same experience, and it's always going to be, you looking at them thinking, okay, this is how I did it for this person, but this person's just a little more unique. Let's readjust. And I think that's where people get it wrong when they search online. I the other day, and I did it. I searched for symptoms, and Google turns out, uh, you're going to die. I'm like, what? No. And I think people do. They resort to the worst case scenario, and it's not always true.
And most often it isn't always true, but the brain is hardwired for survival. So even if there's a tiny chance of the worst case scenario, we tend to overthink that and catastrophize. And that thing with symptoms, I had that. I was in Costa Rica about 2 years ago, and I had, a fever and some diarrhea. Googled it, starts telling me about yellow fever and like 15% death rates. And if I'd have just left it there, I wouldn't have slept that night. I'd be like, "Right, am I going to die?" But I just asked it another question: how many cases of yellow fever have there been in Costa Rica? And it's like there was one, like 4 years before. Okay, now it probably isn't this then. So sometimes it's the quality of the questions, it's the quality of the responses that you get. But if your brain is kind of like, you know, what is it? What is it? And you've got that confirmation bias where your worst fears could be, almost proven. That's how people get themselves in these kind of anxiety loops.
Mhm.
And it is very common. I also think, in terms of how people evaluate the things, you're right. We've got access to more technology. The smartphone has got more computing power than the Apollo missions that got a shuttle to the moon. And yet, most people are trying to numb and distract rather than solve. So if someone's very anxious, then it's easier to drink a beer and watch Netflix than it is to seek out someone that could help you deal with the underlying issue of or cause or thinking process behind that anxiety. And I think culturally, in all Western societies, but I think in a lot of societies, there's more of a desire to kind of treat the symptom than deal with the cause. Almost all of the pharmaceutical industry is built on that premise. And what I try and do as a hypnotherapist is ask a different question. And I'm thinking, almost playing detective, like, what does their underlying belief systems or coping strategies need to be for what this person's doing to make absolute sense? And
Mhm.
a lot of people, they use words like self-sabotage, and oh, I always mess things up, without realizing that actually most unconscious behavior has a positive underlying intention. And if you can figure out what that underlying intention is and meet the same intention but in a more elegant way without the downsides, well then great. I've not drunk alcohol for about 7 years, but I used to drink alcohol if I was stressed. I would used to drink alcohol if I wanted more confidence. Actually, the intention of reducing stress is a pretty good intention, or feeling more confident is a pretty good intention. But I made the psychological flaw of thinking like alcohol is the way that I solve this problem and it's the best or the only way to do it. And of course, it isn't. And I spend a lot of time working with clients to get them realizing that there's choice, that actually what they're doing makes absolute sense, but it's not the only way to do it. If someone's really sad and ice cream makes them feel better, you could understand that's a positive intention to feel better. But ice cream is not the only way to make yourself feel better. There are other ways.
Yeah, I stopped drinking alcohol. And I can't say I stopped. I might have a total of 2 beers a year. So to me, that's basically stopped. I just I I can't say I lost the taste of it. It's just
Mm,
it didn't give me the enjoyment that it used to. I now I drink mostly, Coke Zero or iced tea, and that's it. And people are like, "Well, Rob, we're having a party. There's going to be alcohol. Well, have iced tea or something."
mhm.
Just it's not. And I've gotten a lot thinner. Um, you know, I blame COVID for some of that, but I back in 2021, I had COVID. Man, I was sick for weeks. I ended up going to the
Mm,
hospital. But you know, you reevaluate your life when stuff like that happens, and you're like, okay, what do I need to change? Not
mm,
only to feel healthier, but to live longer. And sometimes, yes, you'll have a dramatic event like COVID that almost kills you, or being in Costa Rica where it almost kills you. To realize, okay, I got to make changes. But
mm.
there's a lot of us out there that don't want those dramatic events. They don't want to feel sick or drunk or this or that. They just want to, you know, have help that they can move forward. And I think that's where you come in, and that's where your superpowers shine. And I think the world
Yeah.
is better for you.
And that was my original intention. We mentioned COVID. Luckily when I got COVID, it wasn't severe symptoms like yours. But when the pandemic came along, I was working in a very prestigious part of London, very high rent on my clinic, and that was a catalyst for me to say, right, I'm not going to have lots of clients seeing me face to face. So let's stop this. And I definitely wanted an outlet to kind of keep my hypnosis. So that was when the idea of the podcast came along, to have a hypnosis-based podcast. And I was sharing my weight loss hypnosis sessions. But the real catalyst for the change was I saw the movie Limitless with Bradley Cooper and Robert De Niro, and I thought, okay, I'm just going to create a hypnosis session based on the premise of the movie. Like, you imagine taking this pill NZT and then tapping into all of these kind of things. But when I decided to have the podcast, I only had two goals. I wanted a creative outlet for me to be experimental, and I set such a low bar. I set the bar that I would want at least one person out there in the world to be positively impacted by the hypnosis that I create. And you can't fail at that. And I think where people get it wrong when they take on these things, like if you wrote books, your first book, and it's like, unless I sell 1 million copies, I'm never going to do it again. Sometimes people have such high expectations of what doing stuff is
Well,
that
let me
actually
clarify that.
they,
It's
they, they lead disappointment.
none of my books have sold anywhere close to 1 million copies. I just enjoy writing, and I think that's
And,
what.
and and I think that's the key thing is like if you do it from a place of the very act of doing it is rewarding, then in my case, it might be clients that I get from a session. In your case, it might be book sales or things like that. That's the cherry on the top.
Mhm.
Where people get it wrong is they have these kind of conscious or unconscious rules. Um, you know, for example, in weight loss, I'll do this diet, but only if I lose weight every single day, every time I weigh myself. And they have one day where they've not lost weight. Right, I'm scrapping this thing.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of expectations and rules or conditions attached to a lot of, human behavior. And a lot of change is based on patience. You do the right thing for long enough and then you get the results. And so
Mhm.
many people kind of quit beforehand. And I found that with my podcast. For the first 3 months I had maybe, you know, 10 people a day listening. And there was one day, I remember it was May the 7th, not a single person listened. It'd only been going for a couple of months. And I'm like, if I made it all about the listeners, I would never continue to do it.
Right.
But the listeners wasn't the point. It was the point of I wanted to keep doing it. And now I get, some days, almost 20,000 listeners a day. But I would never have that if set the conditions early on that, okay, it has to, because then when I get 5 or 10, I'm like, right, I'm not going to do it anymore. So that winning formula that you have is, make the journey just as fun as the destination. If you only link it to the destination, a lot of people quit doing
Well,
very useful things.
even with this podcast, which I started in 2018, I recorded 33 episodes, and then I stopped for like 6 months because I didn't think
Mm,
anybody was listening. And then, after a while, people were like, Rob, when are you coming out with another episode?
yes.
I thought, well, I guess people were listening. And
Mm,
so I recorded an episode 34 just by myself. And then I finally started batch recording. So I would record 12, 16 episodes at a time. And then that way I don't have to worry about it for months and then do it again. And now we're here at it's 2025. This is episode 363. And more people are reaching out. Rob, I love the podcast. I want to be on it. And it's just a fun conversation.
hmm
And if had I stopped all those years ago, half these books wouldn't be written because a
Yeah.
lot of the ideas and the concepts and uh, the things I talk about go into these books. And like this blue book here, the unscripted, unfiltered, unwoo-woo, unguru is a combination of me and Steve Gamlin. Steve had been on this show 8 episodes. And so we turned all those episodes into a book, a transcript book. And people would love it because they could listen to the podcast, but now they have something tangible in their hand that they can take with them anywhere and read along. And people just loved it. And some of the books were a result of people being on my podcast, and they say, Rob, let's do a book together. And so the podcast by itself, it was never intended to make money. It was just me giving back to entrepreneurs and having guests on that could help share their superpowers. And it just grew. And I think sometimes people expect that whatever they're doing needs to have an ROI, where
Yeah.
it needs to pay them this amount of money. But they forget all the back end stuff that could have been created. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think sometimes it's, one of my favorite phrases, like, if in doubt, zoom out. Because, if you're obsessing with the details and you've got an ROI for this, and you know, my if I go to the gym, my ROI isn't to get stronger. Is I feel good going to the gym. Like that's enough of an ROI for me.
Mhm.
Um, and anything else is like a nice byproduct. And I think, when you zoom out and you just say, right, if I was to keep doing this, consistently, does it make my life better, more fulfilled, or less? And it's like, wow, I would enjoy it, and it might lead to other things. Like when I launched my first podcast and radio show, so many opportunities came my way by having guests on, and then I would get a message or an email weeks later, and it's like, oh, I've got this conference. Do you want to speak at it? Or I'm doing this. Do you want to be a part of it? And it's kind of like people underestimate the ability of building a network. And once you build that network, so many opportunities come your way because you're now in the mind of that other person. They're like, who'd be good for this? Opportunities come your way. I speak at almost all of the hypnotherapy conferences, and I don't think I would have those same opportunities had I not launched the hypnosis podcast.
Right.
Because I did. The organizer's like, "I've heard the show. Do you wanna speak?" It's like, "Yeah." It opens so many doors.
Well, and it looks like, back in August, you posted that your podcast got over 50,000 followers, and I think that's amazing.
Yeah. So on Spotify itself, Spotify is the platform, that's the most popular. So yeah, 50,000 followers. And that I got that stat. I love stats that relate to this because it lets me know I'm on the right track. But 2 days before that, I think I hit, 12.5 million downloads across all kind of platforms excluding YouTube, and it was kind of like, you know, originally my goal was like, well, if a million people kind of hear my stuff, like, that'd be amazing. But, you know, it's crazy for me, but it does give me wonderful feedback, that some people appreciate what I'm doing. But equally, I was reading a YouTube comment just before this, and you know, there are people out there that just they love to criticize and it was superficial stuff like the thumbnail had this kind of futuristic kind of mask, and it's like, why have you got a motorcycle helmet on the artwork? It's completely unrelated to the session, but some people like that. And I think it gives you also a level of resilience and kind of a bit of a thick skin
Yeah,
because there
and
was a time in my life that I would be, very conscious about the other people's, thoughts and opinions. But now it's kind of like, oh, okay, that's the thing you're thinking about, like artwork. Like it gives me, yeah, a nice perspective on stuff because I don't mind if 20 people, 50 people, 100 people hate my stuff. It's not for them. It's for the people that, I have people that say, they listen to my stuff every night. It's part of their ritual, their routine. They listen to my hypnosis before they go to sleep at night, and it helps them sleep. So that's great. That's who it's for. It's not for the people that don't like it.
well, and that was, I think for me, that was the hardest thing off the bat was getting bad reviews by
Mm.
somebody I didn't even know that had,
Mhm.
a an empty profile. So you go there, there's no picture, you don't know where they're from, and here they are just hiding behind, their social mask and giving you a bad review, and it's like, whatever. It's like,
Mm.
yeah, and yeah, we're supposed to encourage people to leave reviews. That's what Google wants. That's what we've been trained to tell people. And then you get these bad reviews, and you're like, oh my God, what's going on?
Mm.
And so I just ignore them, and I just keep doing what I do, and I don't allow that hatred or the animosity to affect me. And I know that there's a lot of people out there that they read every single review, and
Mm.
they take the bad ones to heart. What about all the good ones that you just got? Yeah, but they're
Yeah.
gonna tell me good stuff all the time. It's no, don't focus on and it's yeah.
But sometimes it comes from a place of insecurity. Sometimes it comes from a place of, a lot of people that are very critical just aren't generally happy with their lives. And I remember one of there was this not quite a troll, but there was a guy that was commenting on so many of my YouTube videos, and he was like, trying to nitpick at some of the audio quality, and I looked at his profile, and he was an aspiring hypnotherapist, and he'd made I think 12 videos, and he had like about 20 subscribers, and it's kind of like, oh, I can see where this is coming from. You think you should be doing better than me, but I've got that bigger audience. And it's kind of like I can understand that. It feels frustrating. There are there are people that have bigger audiences than me, and I think I'm a better hypnotherapist. That doesn't mean I'm going to start trolling them online. It just makes me want to do better. There's a positive way, and then there's a
Well,
kind
yeah,
of a frustrated way.
that's the whole premise of this podcast, and
Mm,
I invite people on that have these superpowers that are more unique than me. I'm not a hypnotist. I've had other authors on here. I've had other marketers on here. Why? Because I see something in them that will benefit society. And people say, "Well, Rob, why should I be on your show? We do the same thing." No, we don't. You just think we
mhm.
do, but we serve different audiences.
Yeah.
And some people might resonate with me because I'm sarcastic and just the way I carry myself. Other people hate sarcasm and would love my guest. So yeah, let's bring them on. You know, I
Yeah.
I I think when I was younger, I wouldn't have thought that way. I would have thought, why am I bringing competitors on here? But to me, it's we live in this great big world. Yeah, there's millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, probably billions. I don't know. I didn't count. Um, but each one of us is really unique. There is nobody that does what you do in the manner you do it.
And
So
I think that's the thing. And I think when you're concerned about who's getting the bigger slice of the pie, that scarcity mentality actually removes a lot of opportunities. My belief, particularly within hypnotherapy, I have lots of other hypnotherapists on my podcast, is that the pie is more than big enough for everyone, and it's getting bigger. And I use this thought experiment to help me realize just how big the pie is. I say, look, if you imagine stopping 100 random strangers in the street and just asking them, are you addicted to something you don't want to be addicted to? Are you sleeping well? Are you as confident as you want to be? Do you have intrusive thoughts? Do you feel anxious in situations you don't want to feel anxious? And the list goes on. Out of those 100 people, all 100 of them have got at least one of those things they want to work on. We don't have to worry about client. There's too many clients out there.
mhm,
There's too many people. And, I think that there's a book inside everyone. They could kind of share that. And once you realize, like, just how big the market is, how big the opportunity, all of that scarcity goes away. And then you're like, someone's celebrating a win. Good for you. That doesn't It's not a zero-sum game that if you win, I lose. It's like if you win, then I become inspired to win even more. Like everyone can benefit.
mhm. So how do people find you? Where do they go? Well, besides traveling to the UK.
Yeah. So before COVID, most clients would actually see me face to face. Now, bizarrely, most of my clients are not in the UK. Most of my clients are in the States and Canada, in the UAE, in Australia. The easiest way for people to find me, and I can share these links with you. You can put them in the show notes, the description. My podcast. So if you go on any podcast platform and look for the Hypnotist, so the Hypnotist, you're gonna see my face in black and white with a little green eye. You can have a look for that. There's things that I offer. So, for example, if people like the idea of working with me, there's a free 7-day course that I have called Transform Your Life in 7 Days. Again, I'll give the link to you so you can kind of share in the show notes if you like that. Or just my website is adamcox.co.uk. So again, you can check that out. But I would say the easiest thing is to find the podcast. So either on Spotify or YouTube, just look for the Hypnotist and you'll see me come up.
That's awesome. So everybody, I want you to go over and check out his podcast and learn stuff. So I want to thank Adam for being here, and we'll see everybody on the next episode. Adios.
Thank you, Rob.